The wind, a solitary predator howling across the infinite, dust-choked plains of the Wyoming Territory, clawed at the dilapidated cabin. It worried a loose board on the porch with a persistent, dry rattle, a sound like old bones clattering in the throat of the dying day. Inside, the air itself felt bruised, heavy with the cloying stench of stale whiskey, wood smoke that couldn't quite escape the poorly chinked logs, and something less tangible but far more suffocating: fear. It clung to the rough-hewn walls, settled like dust on the meager furniture, and coiled tight in the chest of 13-year-old Lily. She stood defiantly still, her bare feet numb against the cold, splintery floorboards. Her gaze locked not on the erupting volcano of her stepfather's rage, but on the small, violently trembling figure of her 6-year-old brother, Tom, who was trying to make himself disappear behind the scant protection of her threadbare skirt. Jedediah Kurtz hulked near the meager fire sputtering in the stone hearth, casting a monstrous, dancing shadow that swallowed half the small room. He was a man seemingly carved from granite and grudge, his face a roadmap of discontent, etched with the harsh lines of disappointment, and steeped in the perpetual bitterness of cheap liquor. Life hadn't just soured for Jedediah, it had curdled, leaving a poisonous residue that seeped into every corner of their existence after it had claimed their ma nearly 2 years prior, leaving him as their sole, unwilling guardian. Tonight, that bitterness had fermented into pure, unadulterated venom. A dropped tin cup, slipping from Tom's small, unsure fingers and clattering onto the floor, had been the spark landing on dry tinder. Useless, Jedediah snarled, the word rumbling from deep in his chest, a predatory growl that vibrated through the very planks beneath Lily's feet. He lurched forward, his balance precarious, his small, mud-colored eyes, narrowed and vicious like a cornered badger's, fixed on Tom. Worthless scrap. Can't do nothing right. Geez, like your pa. Another mouth to feed, another anchor dragging me down. The mention of their father, dead even longer than ma, was a deliberate cruelty, a twisting knife. Lily flinched, an involuntary recoil against the venom in his tone. But she held her ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat against the desolate moan of the wind outside. This grim overture was horrifyingly familiar, the tightening vice of dread in her stomach, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth, the silent prayer that maybe, just maybe, this time it would pass. But the look in his eyes tonight, glazed with drink and a terrifying vacancy, felt different. It held a ragged edge, a frayed recklessness that sent a fresh wave of icy terror through her. He seemed closer to some precipice than ever before. Leave him be. Jedediah, Lily pleaded, her voice astonishingly thin, barely audible above the wind, yet threaded with a filament of desperate steel she summoned from some hidden reservoir. It was a pathetic shield, her words against the storm of his fury, but it was all she had. He threw his head back and laughed, a sound as pleasant as rocks grinding together, utterly devoid of warmth or humor. Leave him be, he mocked, taking another unsteady step that brought the reek of whiskey sickeningly close. And who's gonna make me? You, skinny little prairie flower like you, he advanced again, the floorboards groaning their protest under his heavy, cracked leather boots. Tom let out a choked whimper, burrowing his face so deep into the folds of Lily's skirt, he seemed to be trying to merge with her. Lily instinctively shifted, pushing Tom further behind her, her own small body a fragile barricade, her hands, calloused from chores far beyond her years, curled into tight, white-knuckled fists at her sides. The familiar, hated tremor started in her knees. a physical manifestation of the dread that seeped into her very marrow. She had intercepted his rage countless times, strategically placing herself between his anger and her little brother. She had absorbed the stinging slaps meant for Tom, deflected the hurled curses, taken the blame for broken crockery and spilled milk. It was a grim, silent contract forged in the ashes of their mother's death. She would be Tom's shield, his fortress, whatever the personal cost. Her own fear, her own pain, were coins she spent willingly, hoarding Tom's fragile sense of safety. He didn't mean it, she repeated, struggling to keep the tremble from her voice, to project a calm she was nowhere near feeling. 'Twas just an accident. The cup was greasy. Accidents cost, Jedediah spat, his temper flaring hotter. His hand, thick-fingered and brutal, shot out, not towards the cowering boy, but seizing Lily's upper arm in a crushing grip. His dirty fingernails dug into her tender flesh like claws. Lily cried out, a sharp, involuntary gasp of pain that was instantly echoed by Tom's piercing scream, a raw, high-pitched sound of pure terror that sliced through the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. So, you want to play the protector, eh? Jedediah sneered, wrenching her forward, off balance, his breath, hot and foul with cheap whiskey and neglect, washed over her face, making her stomach churn. All right then, girl, you pay the freight. His other hand, broad and calloused from indifferent labor, swung up, palm open, poised to strike. Lily squeezed her eyes shut, every muscle tensed, bracing for the familiar, sickening impact. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble for escape, for intervention, for anything but this. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure listened anymore, prayed to her ma's memory, prayed for the wind to somehow sweep them away. But there was only the howling gale outside, mirroring the tempest trapped within these four log walls, miles from any help, under a vast, uncaring sky. Hope felt like a foreign word, a luxury they couldn't afford. Survival was the only currency here, and Lily, barely emerged from childhood herself, was grimly fluent in its harsh demands. Her entire being focused on shielding the terrified child clinging desperately behind her. The blow hung suspended for a torturous second. Jedediah seemed to relish the moment, drawing out her terror, asserting his absolute, ugly dominion. In that agonizing pause, the cabin held only three sounds: Tom's stifled, hiccuping sobs, Jedediah's ragged, heavy breathing, and the relentless, desolate cry of the wind against the rough-hewn logs. The rhythm of their lives settled into a grim cadence, dictated by the unpredictable oscillations of Jedediah's temper and the crushing weight of their isolation. Days dawned pale and indifferent over the endless rolling plains, offering fleeting moments of beauty that felt like mockery before the familiar anxieties of the day descended. Weeks bled into months, each one marked by the gnawing fear of Jedediah's presence. The cabin, small and poorly built, felt less like a home and more like a cage, surrounded by miles of unforgiving wilderness that offered no solace, only a constant reminder of their entrapment. The nearest neighbor was a half-day's ride away, and the ramshackle collection of buildings that passed for a town, a place Jedediah visited only to trade meager pelts for whiskey and resentment, was even further. They were utterly alone, adrift in a sea of prairie grass and Jedediah's simmering rage. His moods were as volatile and treacherous as a summer storm on the plains. There were periods, sometimes stretching for a few days, where a fragile, exhausted peace would settle over the cabin. During these times, Jedediah might spend hours silently staring into the distance, lost in his own bitter thoughts, or might even manage a gruff, non-committal grunt that passed for civility. In these brief respites, Tom might almost forget to flinch, his small shoulders relaxing fractionally. Lily could breathe a little easier, the knot in her stomach loosening its grip, allowing her to focus on the endless chores, mending Jedediah's perpetually ragged clothes, scrubbing the dirt floor with harsh lye soap until her knuckles bled, hauling endless buckets of water from the muddy creek, tending the scraggly garden that yielded barely enough to supplement the poor rations Jedediah provided. But these lulls were deceptive, thin ice over dark water, ready to shatter without warning, a misplaced tool, a meal deemed unsatisfactory, a perceived slight in Lily's tone, or often, nothing at all beyond the internal demons that plagued him, could trigger an eruption. Lily became a reluctant scholar of her stepfather's moods, a hyper-vigilant observer of infinitesimal signs. She learned to read the subtle tightening around his thin lips, the dangerous glint that appeared in his eyes just before the storm broke, the specific way he slammed his empty bottle down on the rough plank table. She developed an instinct for anticipating the explosions, becoming adept at diverting his attention, often drawing his ire onto herself to shield Tom. If Tom accidentally tracked mud onto the floor she'd scrubbed, Lily would quickly claim she'd spilled water. If Tom was too slow fetching firewood, Lily would insist she hadn't reminded him properly. She absorbed the sharp words, the stinging cuffs, the extra work piled onto her already overburdened frame, viewing it as the price of Tom's relative peace. Her childhood was eroding under the constant pressure, replaced by a weary, premature adulthood defined by fear and sacrifice. Tom, meanwhile, seemed to be shrinking inward. The natural boisterousness and boundless curiosity of a 6-year-old were being steadily extinguished, smothered under the blanket of fear. He rarely spoke above a whisper, his laughter, once as bright and effortless as sunlight on water, now almost non-existent. And when it did surface, it sounded brittle, easily broken. He moved through the cabin like a ghost, startling at sudden movements, his small body habitually tensed, his eyes constantly darting towards Jedediah, assessing the threat level. His universe had contracted to the immediate vicinity of Lily. Her presence was his only fixed point, his only source of comfort in a terrifyingly unstable world. He clung to her hand whenever possible, his small fingers seeking reassurance, a silent communication of his dependence and fear. Their only refuge lay in stolen moments, slivers of peace carved out of the oppressive atmosphere. At night, huddled together on the thin straw mattress in the cramped, dusty loft that served as their sleeping space, the wind whistling through the gaps in the roof boards above them, Lily would conjure worlds for Tom. She whispered stories cobbled together from fragmented memories of their ma, tales of kind animals who talked, brave children who outsmarted grumpy giants, hidden valleys where food was plentiful and no one ever shouted. She pointed out the few stars visible through the cracks, giving them hopeful names, weaving fantasies of escape among the constellations, trying desperately to keep some ember of wonder alive in Tom's dimming eyes, and perhaps in her own heart, too. She sang him the lullabies their ma used to sing, her voice often choked with unshed tears, the simple melodies a fragile shield against the darkness, both outside and within. Often, Tom would wake silently crying from nightmares, burying his face in Lily's shoulder, and she would hold him tight, whispering reassurances she didn't feel herself, until his trembling subsided. The idea of escape had taken root in Lily's mind months ago, a desperate, dangerous seed. It started as a fleeting fantasy, a daydream during the endless hours of chores, but gradually solidified into a conviction. They couldn't just endure, they had to live. Survival under Jedediah's thumb wasn't living, it was a slow death of the spirit. One scorching afternoon, when Jedediah had ridden off towards the settlement, leaving behind a palpable silence that felt both freeing and ominous. Lily made her first tentative move, her hands trembling. She gathered a pitifully small collection of supplies, half a loaf of dry, hard bread, a small, leaky water skin she filled at the creek, and the most precious item they owned, the small, smoothly carved wooden bird their pa had made for Tom years ago. One of the few tangible links to a happier past. "We have to try, Tom," she whispered, her voice tight with a terrifying mixture of fear and fierce determination, kneeling beside him in the stifling heat of the loft. "When there's a chance, we have to find somewhere safe." Tom's eyes, too large in his thin face, widened. Fear was his constant companion, but a tiny, desperate spark of hope flickered within them. "Where would we go, Lily?" he breathed. "Away," she said, forcing a confidence she was far from feeling, trying to project an image of strength for him. "Just away from here, somewhere kinder, like in Ma's stories," but looking out through the cracks at the immense, indifferent landscape. The sheer impossibility of it threatened to crush her resolve. Where could two children possibly go? Their desperate gamble was precipitated sooner than Lily had planned. Jedediah returned from the settlement that evening, fouler than a cornered skunk, reeking powerfully of whiskey and failure. He stumbled through the cabin door, tripping over a slightly raised floorboard near the entrance. He went down hard, cursing spectacularly, his rage instantly white-hot and searching for a target. His eyes landed on Lily, who was trying to quietly sweep the hearth. Without a word, he lunged up and struck her across the face. A brutal backhand blow, fueled by drunken frustration. The impact sent her staggering back, stars exploding behind her eyes, the coppery taste of blood filling her mouth. Tom cried out, a sharp sound of distress. That cry sealed their fate. Jedediah pivoted, his furious gaze locking onto the boy. "Shut your trap, you little whelp," he roared, taking a menacing step towards Tom, his hand already raised. In that instant, something cold and hard coalesced within Lily, eclipsing the fear. It wasn't conscious thought, it was pure, protective instinct. Not him, not again. With a speed born of adrenaline and desperation, she lunged towards the cold hearth and seized the heavy, cast iron skillet resting there. It weighed a ton, far too heavy for her slender arms, but a surge of desperate strength flooded her limbs. "Get away from him," she screamed, the voice emerging from her throat raw and unrecognizable, amplified by terror and righteous fury. Jedediah froze, genuinely startled by this unprecedented act of defiance. He saw the heavy skillet gripped in her white knuckles, saw the blazing, desperate fury in her eyes, so different from her usual cowed fear. A slow, ugly smile spread across his unshaven face. "Gettin' feisty, ain't we?" he mocked, taking a deliberate step towards her. "Think that piece o' iron's gonna stop me, girl?" He clearly dismissed the threat, seeing only a skinny girl playing at bravery. But Lily didn't flinch, didn't lower the skillet. She stood her ground, her small body trembling like a leaf in a gale, not just with fear, but with the terrifying strength of absolute resolve. This was the line. He would not cross it. She knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in her bones, that if his hand touched Tom, she would swing that skillet with every ounce of strength she possessed. What would happen after was a terrifying unknown. But the immediate imperative, protect Tom, eclipsed everything else. The standoff stretched, thick and electric, the air crackling. Jedediah hesitated, perhaps seeing something truly dangerous in her eyes for the first time. Not just fear, but the terrifying clarity of someone pushed beyond endurance. Someone with absolutely nothing left to lose. He grunted, a low, uncertain sound in his throat. He glanced from Lily to the skillet, then back to her face. For a long moment, the tension held. Then, with a guttural curse, he spat contemptuously on the floor near her feet, turned abruptly, and stumbled heavily towards his own filthy cot in the corner, collapsing onto it face down. Within minutes, deep, ragged snores filled the cabin. Lily remained frozen, the impossibly heavy skillet still held aloft, her breath tearing in and out of her lungs in painful gasps. Her arms screamed from the strain. Slowly, carefully, she lowered the skillet, her entire body shaking uncontrollably now that the immediate danger had passed. The confrontation had been terrifying, but it had irrevocably shifted the ground beneath their feet. There was no going back. Staying meant waiting for the next explosion, an explosion that might kill one or both of them. It was no longer a question of if they would leave, but how soon. It had to be tonight. Now, under the faint, watery light of a crescent moon, intermittently veiled by thick, scudding clouds that promised a brewing storm, Lily gently shook Tom awake. His eyes fluttered open, instantly wide with fear. "Sheesh," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling slightly. "It's time, Tommy. We have to go. Right now." While he's sleeping, moving with the silence of shadows, they gathered their pathetic bundle. Lily slipped the worn wooden bird into Tom's pocket, hoping its familiar smoothness would offer some comfort. Holding their breath, they crept towards the cabin door. The leather hinges creaked ominously as Lily pulled it open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness, loud enough, she feared, to wake the dead, or worse, Jedediah. She pulled Tom through the opening and eased the door shut behind them, not daring to latch it. Taking his small, icy hand firmly in hers, she paused for a heartbeat, listening to the drunken snores rumbling from within. Then, without looking back at the prison that had been their only home, they melted into the vast, swallowing darkness of the plains. The rising wind whipped Lily's tangled hair across her face, tasting of dust and the coming rain, urging them forward into the terrifying, uncertain embrace of the unknown. Ahead lay danger, hardship, and uncertainty, but also the fragile, flickering promise of freedom. The vast, undulating plains turned hostile under the cloak of night. The moon offered little guidance, frequently obscured by thick, fast-moving clouds, plunging them into near-total blackness. The wind, rising to a mournful howl, seemed to mock their flight, tearing at their inadequate clothing and whipping dust into their eyes. Lily stumbled forward, trying desperately to follow a faint game trail she'd mentally mapped during her solitary chore of fetching water. Praying it led toward civilization, or at least away from Jedediah. Her sense of direction, tenuous at best, felt utterly lost in the disorienting darkness and the featureless landscape. Tom, exhausted and terrified, stumbled repeatedly on the uneven, tussock-strewn ground. His small legs, already weary from a day of fear and tension, could barely keep up with Lily's frantic pace. After his third fall, which scraped his knee badly enough to draw blood, Lily stopped. Without a word, she knelt and hoisted him onto her back, his thin arms wrapped tightly around her neck, his small body surprisingly heavy, his frightened, shallow breaths warming the back of her neck. Her own legs burned with effort, protesting the added weight and the punishing pace. Her lungs felt raw, aching with each ragged gasp of cold, dusty air. But whenever despair threatened to overwhelm her, the vivid image of Jedediah's face, contorted in that final moment of drunken rage, would flash in her mind, propelling her onward. Fear was a powerful fuel. A cold, biting rain began to fall. Not a cleansing shower, but a miserable, persistent drizzle that quickly soaked through their thin clothes, chilling them to the bone. The ground beneath their feet turned from dust to slick, treacherous mud, sucking at their worn, ill-fitting shoes, making each step a Herculean effort. Thunder began to rumble, no longer distant but vibrating overhead, and jagged forks of lightning briefly, terrifyingly illuminated the scene, an endless expanse of rolling, empty prairie devoid of shelter devoid of hope. They were two tiny, insignificant figures lost in a vast, indifferent, and increasingly violent landscape. Panic began to claw at Lily's throat. Where were they going? How could they possibly survive out here? Even if Jedediah didn't follow. The elements themselves felt lethal. Doubt, cold and sharp as the wind, began to erode her desperate resolve. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe staying, enduring, was the only way. But then Tom would let out a small, choked sob behind her, his small body trembling against her back, and her determination would surge anew, fierce and protective. For Tom, she couldn't give up. She wouldn't. She shifted his weight, squared her shoulders, and pushed onward into the teeth of the wind and rain. Dawn arrived not with hopeful light, but as a gradual dilution of the oppressive darkness into a miserable gray twilight. The rain continued, lighter now but persistent, cold. The breaking day revealed the true, soul-crushing desolation of their surroundings. They had put distance between themselves and the cabin. It was no longer visible, swallowed by the rolling land. But they were adrift in an endless sea of wet grass and mud, with no landmark, no sign of human habitation in any direction. Lily's strength was failing. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her vision blurred with fatigue, her stomach cramped with hunger. She spotted a shallow overhang beneath a cluster of weathered rocks, offering meager protection from the relentless drizzle. Stumbling towards it, she slid to the ground, carefully easing Tom down beside her. She huddled with him, pulling her threadbare shawl, soaked and useless as it was, tighter around their shivering bodies. She retrieved the last half of the stale bread from their bundle. It was damp and doughy, but it was food. She broke it in two, giving the slightly larger piece to Tom, and rationed a few sips of water from the nearly empty water skin. "Are we safe now, Lily?" Tom asked, his voice small and hoarse, his eyes wide with exhaustion and lingering fear, scanning the empty horizon. Lily forced a smile that felt like cracking pottery. "We're safer, Tommy," she lied, trying to infuse her voice with a confidence that felt 1,000 miles away. "He won't find us here. We just need to rest a little. Then we'll find a real town." But even as she spoke the words, a cold dread spread through her. Jedediah wasn't stupid, not when it came to tracking or asserting what he considered his, and he was relentless. The sound reached them moments later, faint at first, almost lost in the sighing wind, a distant shout, angry and familiar. Lily's heart plummeted. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. Jedediah, he hadn't given up. He was hunting them. Raw panic, sharp and electrifying, surged through her. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing Tom's hand, pulling him roughly from their inadequate shelter. "Run! Tommy! He's coming! Run!" They bolted out from under the rocks, back into the open misery of the rain-swept plains. Lily risked a glance over her shoulder. There he was, a dark figure on horseback, still a fair distance away, but silhouetted starkly against the gray skyline, moving with relentless purpose. He had found their trail. He was closing in. The chase resumed, but now it was fueled by sheer, primal terror. Lily pushed Tom, urged him onward, her own body screaming with agony. A sharp stitch stabbed at her side, forcing ragged breaths. Her vision swam. Tom was sobbing openly now, stumbling, his small face streaked with mud and tears, his breath coming in desperate, painful gasps. The distance between them and their pursuer shrank with terrifying speed. Jedediah's shouts became clearer, carried on the wind, vicious curses, furious promises of the pain he would inflict when he caught them. They scrambled up the crest of a low, muddy rise, Lily desperately hoping to see shelter, a hiding place, anything. Instead, laid out before them was a new, insurmountable obstacle, a river, swollen and angry from the heavy rains. It churned violently, a wide, turbulent ribbon of muddy brown water cutting through the landscape. Far too wide to swim, too fast and debris-choked to even attempt crossing. They were trapped, the end of the line. Lily spun around, pulling Tom protectively behind her, her back almost literally to the raging water. The roar of the river filled her ears. Jedediah, seeing them cornered, reined in his lathered horse a short distance away, a figure of absolute menace against the bleak, stormy sky. He swung down from the saddle, his movements deliberate, savoring his victory. A cruel, triumphant smile twisted his lips as he started towards them on foot, his heavy boots sinking slightly into the sodden earth. Well, well, nowhere left to run. Is there, girl? He sneered, his voice dripping with malice. He advanced slowly, enjoying their terror. Thought you could just up and leave, did you? Thought you could steal what's mine. He wasn't talking about possessions, he meant them, their labor, their very presence, which he simultaneously resented and fiercely possessed. Lily stood her ground, a small, defiant figure shielding her even smaller brother, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against cage bars. There was no escape route. The hostile wilderness stretched endlessly behind them. The impassable, churning river roared at their backs, and the architect of all their misery and fear stood before them, radiating violent intent. She squeezed Tom's hand so hard her knuckles were white, bracing herself for the inevitable. This was it. The desperate gamble had failed. Jedediah raised his hand, the same thick, calloused hand that had dispensed so much casual cruelty, ready to seize her, to drag them back to the nightmare, ready to exact his terrible punishment for their defiance. Fear, absolute and paralyzing, washed over Lily in an icy wave. She closed her eyes, a single, silent prayer escaping her lips, not for herself anymore, only for Tom. Let him be spared. Then, cutting through the roar of the river, the drumming rain, and Jedediah's menacing approach, came a new sound, the distinct, rhythmic thud of horses' hooves on wet earth. But they weren't coming from behind, from the direction Jedediah had come. They were approaching from the side, moving purposefully along the riverbank. Lily's eyes snapped open, hope flaring unexpectedly, desperately, materializing out of the gray mist and rain. Like a phantom conjured by the storm itself, was a lone rider. He sat astride a magnificent paint horse, its coat gleaming wetly, its breath pluming in the cold air. The rider was Cheyenne. Raindrops glistened on his bare, copper shoulders and clung to the intricate quillwork and beadwork adorning his deerskin leggings and breechcloth. His dark hair, long and lustrous, was bound in 2 braids wrapped in otter fur. His face, weathered and striking, was set in lines of stern composure, yet his eyes, dark, intelligent, and incredibly sharp, missed nothing. They swept across the scene in an instant, taking in the terrified, mud-caked children, the menacing white man advancing upon them, the churning river at their backs. He carried no rifle, only a long bow slung across his back and a sheathed knife at his hip. Yet his very presence radiated a calm, potent authority that brought Jedediah to an abrupt halt. The warrior's piercing gaze flickered from Lily's tear-streaked, defiant face to Tom, hiding behind her, then settled with unnerving intensity on Jedediah, before returning to meet Lily's eyes. In that brief contact, she saw not hostility, but a startling perception, as if he could read the entire history of their fear and desperation in that single glance. He didn't speak immediately, allowing his silent presence to disrupt Jedediah's momentum, his stillness a stark contrast to the surrounding turmoil. Jedediah, momentarily thrown off by this unexpected, unwelcome intrusion, puffed out his chest, resorting to bluster and ingrained prejudice. "This ain't none of your affair, Injun," he spat, his voice overly loud, betraying his unease. "These here are my stepkids. Runaways, just taking 'em back where they belong." The Cheyenne warrior dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of innate power and confidence. Landing lightly on the muddy bank despite the treacherous footing, he began walking towards them, not with overt aggression, but with a slow, deliberate stride that commanded attention. His dark eyes, when they met Lily's again, held an unnerving depth, acknowledging her terror, but also seeming to recognize the fierce protectiveness in her stance. He stopped a few paces away, subtly, strategically positioning himself directly between Jedediah and the two children. "Home," the warrior finally spoke, his voice low and resonant, yet carrying clearly over the sounds of the wind and river. He gestured towards Lily and Tom, not with his hand, but with a slight inclination of his head. "They do not look like children returning home. They look like frightened deer cornered by a wolf." Jedediah bristled, his face flushing angrily under his grime. "Now you listen here, savage." The warrior raised a hand, palm outward, a simple, almost casual gesture. Yet it possessed an undeniable authority that cut Jedediah off mid-insult. His eyes, steady and dark as river stones, remained fixed on Jedediah's face. "I see the fresh mark on the girl's cheek," he stated quietly, his gaze flicking momentarily to the angry red bruise blooming there from the previous night's blow, a stark testament against Jedediah's claim of merely retrieving runaways. "I see the terror in the small one's eyes. It is a fear that does not come from running in the rain. It is the fear of the hand that strikes." His perception was unnervingly accurate. Jedediah shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable under that unwavering, knowing gaze. He was accustomed to wielding fear, not facing calm, perceptive disapproval, especially from a man he considered beneath him. He glanced nervously from the warrior's impassive face to the handle of the knife clearly visible at his hip, then back again. "They're mine," Jedediah insisted, trying to reassert his authority, his voice lacking its earlier bullying conviction. "The law gives me rights over 'em." The warrior's expression remained unchanged, stern but not overtly hostile. Yet, a subtle hardening entered his eyes, a glint of steel beneath the calm surface. "There is the white man's law," he acknowledged, his gaze sweeping briefly over the harsh, rain-lashed landscape as if drawing strength from it. "And there is the Creator's law. The spirits of this land do not smile on cruelty shown to the young, the helpless." He took another deliberate step forward, closing the distance slightly, his presence seeming to expand, solid and immovable. "You will leave them be." It wasn't a request, nor was it a direct threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with quiet, absolute certainty, backed by an unspoken moral weight and the warrior's undeniable physical presence. Jedediah looked from the impassive Cheyenne to the terrified children huddled near the riverbank, then back to the warrior. He saw the man's calm readiness, the subtle but unmistakable way his hand rested lightly near the hilt of his knife. He registered the warrior's complete ease in this wild environment, a stark contrast to his own blustering discomfort. He calculated the odds. He was armed only with his fists and his fury, facing a man who was clearly strong, composed, and disapproving, in the middle of nowhere, with no witnesses sympathetic to him. Cowardice, the ugly twin of his cruelty, began to whisper urgently in his ear. He hesitated, his face a mask of conflicting rage, frustration, and burgeoning fear. The warrior simply waited, his silence amplifying the tension, more effective than any shouted threat. Finally, with a strangled curse that was whipped away by a sudden gust of wind, Jedediah spat onto the mud near the warrior's feet, a final, futile gesture of defiance that held no real power. He began backing away slowly, cautiously, never taking his eyes off the Cheyenne, until he reached his horse. Scrambling clumsily into the saddle, he cast one last look back, his eyes filled with venomous hatred directed at Lily and Tom, and at the warrior who had thwarted him. "You ain't seen the last of me," he snarled, the threat sounding weak and petulant against the backdrop of the storm. Then, yanking brutally on the reins, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it mercilessly back the way he had come, quickly becoming a diminishing figure swallowed by the gray curtain of rain and mist. An immense, almost painful silence descended, broken only by the ceaseless roar of the swollen river and Tom's ragged, hiccuping sobs. Sounds not of terror now, but of overwhelming relief. Lily stared numbly after Jedediah's retreating form, her mind struggling to grasp that he was actually gone, that the immediate nightmare was over. Disbelief warred with a tidal wave of exhaustion and gratitude. Then, slowly, she turned her gaze to the Cheyenne warrior, who now gave her and Tom his full, quiet attention. The sternness in his expression softened perceptibly as he looked at Tom's small, tear-streaked face, then met Lily's wide, questioning eyes. In his gaze, she saw not judgment or threat, but a deep, unexpected reservoir of compassion. He moved closer and knelt smoothly on the muddy ground, bringing himself down to their level, seemingly unconcerned about the wet earth soaking his leggings. "The danger has passed," he said gently, his voice losing the hard edge it had held when confronting Jedediah. "You are safe now," he paused, then added simply, "My name is White Eagle." He saw their shivering, their utter exhaustion, the deep-seated fear still lingering in their eyes despite Jedediah's departure. He saw the mud caking their clothes, the scratches on Lily's arms, the bruise on her face. But he also saw the fierce protectiveness in Lily's stance, the resilience shining through the terror, and in that moment, standing on the bank of a raging river beneath a weeping sky, the bleak trajectory of their young lives was utterly, irrevocably altered, guided not by brutality or the indifferent laws of men, but by the quiet, unexpected courage of a single act of human kindness. The adrenaline that had sustained Lily through the chase and confrontation drained away abruptly, leaving her weak-kneed and trembling violently. The reality of their deliverance washed over her, so immense it was almost painful. Tom, sensing the shift, finally let go of his terrified grip on her skirt and leaned heavily against her, his small body racked with the aftermath of terror. White Eagle remained kneeling patiently, his calm presence a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of Lily's emotions. He didn't bombard them with questions about their ordeal, didn't pry into the circumstances that had driven them into the storm. He simply observed, his silence conveying empathy more effectively than words. He noted their soaked clothes, the blue tinge around Tom's lips, The way Lily swayed slightly from exhaustion, with economical, purposeful movements, he rose and went to his horse. From a bundle tied behind his saddle, he retrieved a thick, beautifully tanned buffalo robe, heavy and smelling faintly of wood smoke and sage. Returning to them, he carefully, respectfully wrapped it around both Lily and Tom, cocooning them in its immediate, profound warmth. The contrast between the biting cold of the rain and the luxurious heat of the robe was startling, a physical manifestation of the shift from danger to safety. "Come," White Eagle said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "There is dry shelter nearby, a place hidden. You need rest, food, warmth." Lily hesitated for only a heartbeat. Years of Jedediah's poisonous warnings about Injuns, coupled with the general fear and prejudice prevalent on the frontier, warred briefly with the undeniable truth of what had just happened. This man, this stranger from a feared people, hadn't harmed them. He had faced down their tormentor. He hadn't judged them. He had perceived their suffering. He hadn't ignored them. He had intervened, looking into his steady, dark eyes. She saw no deceit, no threat, only a quiet integrity and a deep, sorrowful understanding. Trust felt like a fragile, unfamiliar seedling, but it was there. She nodded mutely, pulling the heavy robe tighter around Tom, who had stopped crying and was now regarding their rescuer with wide, exhausted, but intensely curious eyes. White Eagle moved with quiet efficiency. He spoke softly to his horse, then gently lifted Lily, seating her securely in front of him on the saddle blanket. He then carefully lifted Tom, placing the small, shivering boy in Lily's lap, ensuring the buffalo robe enveloped them both completely. The horse, sturdy and sure-footed, moved with a calm intelligence, picking its way carefully along the muddy, slippery riverbank, responding to White Eagle's subtle cues, his hand resting lightly on its neck. The journey was undertaken largely in silence, a stark contrast to their frantic flight. The only sounds were the receding rumble of thunder, the diminishing sigh of the rain, the squelch of the horse's hooves in the mud, and the steady, reassuring rhythm of White Eagle's breathing behind Lily. She could feel the solid warmth of his body shielding her from the wind, a presence that felt profoundly protective after years of vulnerability. After perhaps an hour of steady travel, following the winding river downstream, White Eagle guided the horse away from the bank towards a seemingly unremarkable cluster of rocks and dense brush on a gently sloping hillside. He dismounted and pushed aside a curtain of tangled, thorny bushes, revealing the narrow entrance to a hidden cave. Inside, it was surprisingly spacious and, most importantly, completely dry. The air was still and cool. A rough circle of stones marked a fire pit containing the gray ashes of a previous fire, and several neatly packed parfleche bags. Stiff, painted rawhide containers were stacked against one wall. It was a simple, natural shelter, perhaps used by hunters or travelers of his tribe, yet to Lily, it felt like a sanctuary, the safest haven she had ever known. White Eagle quickly set about rekindling the fire, using dried tinder he produced from one of his pouches and striking flint against steel. He soon had small, cheerful flames licking at the dry twigs he'd gathered, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls and radiating a welcome, life-giving warmth. While the fire grew, he took dried venison jerky and a handful of sun-dried berries from a parfleche bag, offering them to the children. Lily's stomach cramped with hunger, and she accepted the food gratefully. Tom, his earlier terror slowly giving way to exhaustion and curiosity, ate hungrily, his eyes frequently darting towards White Eagle, observing his quiet movements. Lily ate more slowly, the simple, nourishing food tasting better than anything she could remember. her mind still reeling, struggling to process the dizzying turn of events. Jedediah's menacing face felt like a phantom from another life, replaced by the calm, weathered profile of the Cheyenne warrior tending the fire. As they ate and warmed themselves, White Eagle spoke, his voice low and calm. He didn't ask about Jedediah or why they were running. Instead, he talked quietly about the river, how its mood changed with the seasons, about the hawk circling overhead now that the rain had stopped, about the way the deer moved through the brush unseen. He treated them not as pitiable burdens or objects of curiosity, but with a quiet, innate respect that Lily found deeply affecting. When Tom, emboldened by the food and warmth, hesitantly asked about the paint horse tethered just outside the cave entrance, White Eagle answered him directly and simply, explaining the markings. He answered Lily's softly spoken question about the patterns on his beaded leggings, explaining they told a story of his family and a successful hunt. He asked nothing intrusive in return, sensing, perhaps, their need for silence, their need to simply absorb the reality of being safe. That night, cocooned in the heavy warmth of the buffalo robe near the gently crackling fire, with Tom finally sleeping soundly beside her, his small face relaxed for the first time in memory, Lily experienced a profound sense of peace that was utterly alien. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her shadow for years began, tentatively, to loosen its grip. She lay awake for a long time, watching White Eagle. He sat near the cave entrance, a silent, unmoving silhouette against the moonlit landscape outside. His vigil, a quiet promise of protection. He was a man from a different world, a different culture, someone she had been taught to fear. Yet, he had shown them more kindness, more fundamental human decency than anyone from her own world had since her ma died. His compassion, offered without expectation or judgment, felt like a beacon in the vast darkness of her young life. He hadn't just saved their bodies from Jedediah and the storm. He felt like he was beginning to save something essential within her spirit, something that had been starved and close to extinguishing. She finally drifted off to sleep, not to the familiar tune of fear, but to the quiet rhythm of the warrior's breathing and the crackle of the protective fire. They remained in the sanctuary of the hidden cave for 2 full days. Under White Eagle's quiet care, they slowly began to recover from their ordeal. He shared his limited provisions generously, supplementing the jerky and berries with edible roots he dug nearby and small fish he caught skillfully with a simple line in the now calmer river. He showed Lily how to clean the fish and roast them over the coals. He tended to the scrapes on Tom's knee and the cuts on Lily's hands with gentle efficiency. Applying a soothing herbal salve from one of his pouches, he spoke little, but his actions conveyed volumes. He treated Tom with a quiet patience that was the antithesis of Jedediah's explosive cruelty, showing the boy how to identify different bird calls and the subtle tracks left by rabbits and foxes in the damp earth near the cave. He shared his knowledge of the land with Lily, pointing out which plants were useful for medicine or food, explaining things with a simple clarity that respected her intelligence. There was no condescension, no obligation implied in his care, only a deep-seated decency, a profound respect for life, especially for the young and vulnerable. Slowly, tentatively, Lily began to truly trust him, the fear of the other replaced by gratitude and a dawning admiration. Tom, shedding his fear like a snake sheds its skin, started following White Eagle around the small area outside the cave, watching him with fascinated eyes. On the morning of the 3rd day, the sky was clear, the air crisp and clean. White Eagle surveyed the surroundings, his experienced eyes scanning the landscape. He determined it was safe enough to travel again, he explained to Lily, in his quiet, direct manner. that taking them to his own people, his tribe's winter camp several days' journey north, was not feasible. It would pose dangers to them, children unused to the harshness of that life, and potentially to his people as well, given the tensions with settlers and soldiers. But he knew of another place, he told her. A small mission run by peaceful white people, Quakers they were called, located several days' ride to the south, nestled in a protected valley. These Quakers, he explained, were known for their kindness, for offering refuge to those in need, regardless of their background. He would take them there. It was the best chance for their safety and future. The journey south was a revelation for Lily, traveling openly now, under White Eagle's unobtrusive protection. The plains that had seemed so terrifyingly vast and hostile during their flight began to reveal a different character. It was still a harsh, demanding land, but White Eagle showed them its hidden life, its subtle beauty. He moved through it with an intimate knowledge and quiet reverence that was captivating. He pointed out distant buttes that served as landmarks, explained how the direction of the wind shaped the grasses, showed them where to find clear water seeping from rocks. He moved with a confidence and grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in harmony with this environment. He shared simple stories, not intrusive personal histories, but tales of Coyote the trickster, of the eagle's wisdom, of the buffalo's generosity, stories that subtly imparted lessons about resilience, observation, and respect for the natural world. Lily listened intently, absorbing not just the words, but the quiet dignity of the storyteller, the deep spiritual connection he seemed to have with everything around them. Tom, increasingly bold, sometimes rode perched proudly before White Eagle on the paint horse, chattering away with childish questions that White Eagle answered with solemn patience, his small hand occasionally resting trustingly on the warrior's strong forearm. Lily felt a strange mix of emotions, immense gratitude, burgeoning respect, and a poignant awareness that this time, this fragile peace, was temporary. After 4 days of steady travel, White Eagle pointed towards a distant notch in the rolling hills. As they drew closer, Lily saw them, a small cluster of simple, sturdy buildings nestled in a green, sheltered valley, smoke curling peacefully from a chimney. The Quaker mission. A wave of complex feelings washed over Lily, profound relief at reaching safety, mingled with an unexpected sharp pang of sorrow. Their journey with White Eagle, the man who had emerged from the storm like a guardian spirit, was coming to an end. He had been their rescuer, their protector, their guide, and in his quiet way, their teacher. He had shown them that strength wasn't loudness or brutality, but quiet courage and profound compassion. He rode with them right up to the rough wooden gate of the mission compound, where a woman in a plain gray dress and white cap, her face etched with kindness and laugh lines around her eyes, came out to greet them, her expression one of gentle surprise at the sight of the imposing Cheyenne warrior with 2 disheveled white children. White Eagle dismounted and spoke to her briefly, his words in English economical, but conveying the essential information. He spoke of finding the children alone, fleeing hardship, needing sanctuary and care. He tactfully omitted the violent details, leaving it to Lily to share her story if and when she felt ready. Granting her dignity Jedediah had never allowed, the Quaker woman, who introduced herself as Sister Ruth, listened intently, her compassionate gaze moving from the warrior to the 2 children huddled beside him. She saw their exhaustion, the haunted look still lingering deep in Lily's eyes, the way Tom clung to his sister's hand. She saw the fine buffalo robe wrapped around them. Her gaze met White Eagle's, and in that moment, a silent understanding seemed to pass between these 2 people from vastly different worlds. united by a shared concern for the children's welfare. "They are welcome here," Sister Ruth said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "We will provide them with shelter and care. Thank thee, friend, for thy great kindness in bringing them to safety." White Eagle gave a single, solemn nod in acknowledgement. He turned then, his gaze resting on Lily and Tom one last time. For a fleeting moment, the stern mask of the warrior seemed to soften, revealing a flicker of genuine warmth, perhaps even sadness, in his dark eyes. He reached into a small, beaded pouch tied at his belt and drew out something small and white. It was a piece of bone, smoothly carved and polished into the shape of a single eagle feather. He stepped forward and gently pressed it into Lily's hand. "Courage," he said softly, his deep voice barely above a whisper, his gaze holding hers intently. "And compassion. Do not forget these things. They are strong medicine." Then, with another quiet nod to Sister Ruth, he turned without further word, swung gracefully onto his paint horse, and rode away. He didn't look back, simply melting back into the vast, indifferent landscape from which he had so providentially emerged, leaving behind two children whose lives he had utterly transformed. Lily clutched the smooth, cool bone feather, its tangible reality a grounding force amidst the swirling emotions. She watched him ride away until he was just a speck on the horizon, a silent promise taking shape in the deepest part of her heart. She would remember. She would never forget. She would strive to carry his lesson, his A-strong medicine, forward into whatever future awaited them. Life within the quiet, ordered embrace of the Quaker mission unfolded with a gentle rhythm utterly unlike anything Lily and Tom had ever known. Sister Ruth and the few other friends who ran the small outpost, dedicated to peace, education, and service, enveloped them in an atmosphere of calm acceptance and practical kindness. The initial days were a blur of disorientation, adjustment, and the slow, cautious shedding of ingrained fear. Tom, especially, took time to understand that no one here would shout, no one would raise a hand in anger. He gradually uncoiled, his small shoulders losing their perpetual hunch, his eyes slowly relinquishing their hunted look. He was fascinated by the mission school, rudimentary as it was, and eagerly soaked up the lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic offered by Sister Ruth. His mind, starved for so long, proving quick and bright, laughter, genuine and unrestrained, began to bubble up from him, a sound Lily hadn't realized how much she'd missed until she heard it again. Echoing sweetly in the mission yard, Lily, older and carrying deeper, more complex scars, found the transition more challenging. While profoundly grateful for the safety and kindness, the constant peace felt unsettling at first, the absence of imminent threat leaving a void filled with restless memories. Nightmares still visited her, filled with Jedediah's snarling face and the terror of the chase. She threw herself into work, helping Sister Ruth with chores, tending the larger garden that supplied the mission, mending clothes for other needy families who occasionally sought refuge there. Work felt familiar, purposeful, but she also spent hours simply sitting, clutching the eagle feather carving, replaying White Eagle's intervention, his quiet strength, his parting words, courage, compassion. They became her mantra, her focus. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, they gradually integrated into the small, supportive community that grew around the mission. Tom thrived, growing into a sturdy, thoughtful boy, his early trauma receding, though never entirely forgotten, transformed into a deep appreciation for kindness and a fierce loyalty to his sister. He loved listening to the Quakers talk about peace and equality, ideas that resonated deeply after his experience with their violent antithesis. Lily, too, began to heal, though her path was different. The physical marks left by Jedediah faded completely, but the invisible wounds remained. The memory of the abuse, the constant fear, the suffocating helplessness, these were etched into her soul. Yet, counterbalancing that darkness was the enduring light of White Eagle's act. His image, calm, strong, compassionate, defying prejudice to help strangers, became inextricably linked with her idea of true bravery. He represented the possibility of goodness in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. She began to talk, hesitantly at first, sharing fragments of her story with Sister Ruth, whose quiet, non-judgmental listening created a safe space for Lily's pain. And as she spoke, she began to see her own experience not just as personal suffering, but as part of a larger pattern she saw reflected, albeit often hidden, in the lives of others on the frontier, women enduring hardship and mistreatment in silence, children neglected or abused behind the closed doors of isolated homesteads, families struggling against poverty and despair. The eagle feather felt heavier in her hand now, not just a reminder, but a responsibility. White Eagle hadn't just saved them, he had shown her the power of intervention, the moral imperative to stand against cruelty. His courage wasn't just in facing Jedediah, it was in choosing compassion over indifference. Fueled by her own survival, guided by the Quaker principles of social justice she absorbed daily, and deeply inspired by the memory of the Cheyenne warrior, a new resolve hardened within Lily. She couldn't remain silent. She wouldn't stand by while others suffered as she and Tom had. Her advocacy began modestly. She started by offering quiet support to other women at the mission, recognizing the signs of hidden fear or abuse, sharing her own experiences when appropriate, letting them know they weren't alone. She helped Sister Ruth document cases of need or injustice to present to traveling officials or church bodies. Her voice, initially trembling and uncertain in community meetings where she might speak up for a family needing assistance, grew steadily stronger, clearer, more confident. She learned to read and write fluently, devouring any books the mission possessed, especially those on law, ethics, and social reform. She began writing letters, carefully worded, impassioned pleas to territorial administrators, to newspaper editors in distant Cheyenne or Denver, drawing attention to the plight of vulnerable families, the lack of resources, the pervasive silence surrounding domestic violence on the frontier. She argued that true community strength wasn't just about surviving the elements or fighting off external threats. It was about protecting the weakest within. Ensuring justice and compassion began at home. Her work wasn't met with universal approval. She faced pushback, skepticism, outright hostility. Men accustomed to unquestioned authority within their homes resented her interference. Some dismissed her concerns as exaggerated female sensibilities. Others clung fiercely to the notion that family matters were strictly private, no matter how brutal. She was called meddlesome, idealistic, even dangerous for challenging the established order. But Lily, remembering the terror she had felt, remembering the strength she had drawn from White Eagle's quiet defiance, persisted. She had faced Jedediah. She could face down prejudice and indifference. She worked with Sister Ruth and other like-minded individuals in the growing settlement to establish practical support systems, a network for sharing food and resources, a discreet system for warning women if an abusive husband was heading home drunk from town, and eventually securing funding to convert an old outbuilding into one of the territory's first dedicated shelters, a safe house where women and children could find temporary refuge and support. She became known not just as a survivor, but as a fighter, a fierce, articulate advocate for those who had no voice. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, after a long day of work, teaching, or advocacy. Lily would walk to the edge of the settlement, looking out over the vast rolling plains, now tinged golden by the setting sun. The landscape that had once seemed like a prison now felt different, still vast, still demanding, but holding the promise of freedom, of resilience, of new beginnings. She would hold the smooth, cool eagle feather carving in her hand, its shape familiar and comforting. She would remember the icy rain, the churning river, Jedediah's hate-filled face, and then, inevitably, she would see White Eagle, emerging like a spirit from the storm, his calm eyes meeting hers, his voice speaking the words that had become the compass for her life: courage, compassion. She never saw him again. She didn't know his fate, whether he still rode the plains, whether his tribe was safe. But his legacy lived on, not in stone monuments or written histories, but in her actions, in the lives she touched, in the change she fought for. He had planted a seed of hope in the desolate soil of her childhood, and she had nurtured it, cultivating it into a life dedicated to ensuring that fewer children would have to endure the darkness she had known, working tirelessly towards a future where the fundamental human values of courage and compassion might finally shine, even into the most brutal and hidden corners of the human heart. Her life became her answer to his kindness, an enduring testament to the profound, world-altering power of a single warrior's compassionate heart.